Namaste, and thank you for viewing these videos on the Bhagavad Gita chapter by chapter. So here is chapter 4, which is titled Transcendental Knowledge, and it contains 42 verses. In the previous chapter 3, Krishna spoke to Arjuna about his duties. Now here in chapter 4, Krishna reminds us that knowledge is needed in order to properly execute the duties that he was recommending to Arjuna. Thus, you can see where the title easily arose, Transcendental Knowledge. Now, for the first time in this conversation with Arjuna, Krishna begins to give some details about himself. In some ways, you could say that he's giving his credentials as the teacher of Bhagavad Gita. He does this by giving information of his previously having taught this knowledge long ago, and to whom he spoke it. Following this historical account, Arjuna asks his only question for the whole of chapter 4. He inquires, "How could you have taught the sun god who is senior by birth to you?" So Krishna then lays the foundation of his supremacy, his omnipotence. Thus, chapter 4 begins on these two notes of history and supremacy. As for the ending of this chapter, well, previously, at the end of chapter 3, Krishna identified lust as the enemy of mankind, an enemy that must be destroyed. Here, at the end of chapter 4, Krishna identifies doubt as a very key problem in our attempts to perform devotional service. Krishna recommends destroying our doubts with the sword of transcendental knowledge. So there you have a short overview of chapter 4. And also note that there are many famous verses in chapter 4, maybe 6 or 7 of them. I've divided the chapter into 7 segments and highlighted 26 of the 42 verses. Let's begin with segment 1, which covers the opening verses 1 to 3, with Krishna's historical account, explaining that what he is speaking to Arjuna just before this great battle, he had previously explained in the past. In fact, many millions of years beforehand. So let's begin. Verse 1. The Blessed Lord said, "I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god, Vivaswan, and Vivaswan instructed it to Manu, the father of mankind, and Manu in turn instructed it to Ikshvaku. This supreme science was thus received through the chain of disciplic succession, and the saintly kings understood it in that way. But in course of time, the succession was broken, and therefore the science as it is appears to be lost. That very ancient science of the relationship with the Supreme is today told by me to you because you are my devotee, as well as my friend. Therefore, you can understand the transcendental mystery of this science." Segment 2, which are verses 4 to 11. Now, in these verses, Arjuna makes an inquiry, and in response, Krishna begins to state his transcendental nature, including his ever-fresh memory. In the material world, the living entity transmigrates from one body to another and doesn't remember anything or very little about his previous birth. let alone his countless previous births. In fact, if someone is asked what he did exactly at that same time one day earlier, it would be very difficult to answer immediately. But the Supreme Lord remembers everything. So let's begin. Verse 4. Arjuna said, "The sun god Vivaswan is senior by birth to you. How am I to understand that in the beginning you instructed this science to him?" The Blessed Lord said, "Many, many births both you and I have passed. I can remember all of them, but you cannot, O subduer of the enemy." And now there is that very famous verse 7. Whenever and wherever there is a decline in religious practice, O descendant of Bharat, and a predominant rise of irreligion, at that time I descend myself. One who knows the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving the body, take his birth again in this material world, but attains my eternal abode, O Arjuna. So segment 3, which are verses 12 to 18. In this segment, Krishna explains the results of actions. For example, those who are impersonalists, he awards them absorption into the Brahmajyoti. For the fruit of workers, the Lord awards the desired results of their prescribed duties, and so on and so on. Everyone is dependent upon Krishna's mercy alone. Verse 12. Men in this world desire success in fruitive activities, and therefore they worship the demigods. Quickly, of course, men get results from fruitive work in this world. There is no work that affects me, nor do I aspire for the fruits of action. One who understands this truth about me also does not become entangled in the fruitive reactions of work. All the liberated souls in ancient times acted with this understanding and so attained liberation. Therefore, as the ancients, you should perform your duty in this divine consciousness. So he's speaking about transcendental knowledge. Segment 4, verses 19 to 24. In these verses, Krishna describes the mindset of a person who is engaged in action, but with transcendental knowledge. Verse 19. One is understood to be in full knowledge, whose every act is devoid of desire for sense gratification. He is said by sages to be a worker whose fruit of action is burned up by the fire of perfect knowledge. He who is satisfied with gain, which comes of its own accord, who is free from duality and does not envy, who is steady both in success and failure, is never entangled although performing actions. Segment 5, which are verses 25 to 30. Having spoken about work, Krishna now explains different sacrifices. Sacrifices such as sacrifice of one's senses, sacrificing one's material possessions, and so on. Verse 25. Some yogis perfectly worship the demigods by offering different sacrifices to them, and some of them offer sacrifices in the fire of the Supreme Brahman. Some of them sacrifice the hearing process and the senses in the fire of the controlled mind. And others sacrifice the objects of the senses, such as sound, in the fire of sacrifice. There are others who, enlightened by sacrificing the material possessions in severe austerities, take strict vows and practice the yoga of eightfold mysticism, and others study the Vedas for the advancement of transcendental knowledge. Segment 6, verse 31 to 38. So continuing this subject on sacrifices. If sacrifice of one's material possessions is not dovetailed for spiritual realization, then such sacrifice becomes material. But one who performs such sacrifices with a spiritual objective or in devotional service, then their sacrifice becomes perfect. So let's begin. Verse 31. O best of the Kuru dynasty, without sacrifice one can never live happily on this planet or in this life. What then of the next? And now this is when Krishna is going to declare 5 iconic verses. Verse 34. Just try to learn the truth by approaching a spiritual master. Inquire from him submissively and render service unto him. The self-realized soul can impart knowledge unto you because he has seen the truth. And when you have thus learned the truth, you will know that all living beings are but part of me, and that they are in me and are mine. Even if you are considered to be the most sinful of all sinners, when you are situated in the boat of transcendental knowledge, you will be able to cross over the ocean of miseries. As the blazing fire turns firewood to ashes, O Arjuna, so does the fire of knowledge burn to ashes all reactions to material activities. In this world there is nothing so sublime and pure as transcendental knowledge. Such knowledge is the mature fruits of all mysticism, and one who has achieved this enjoys the self within himself in due course of time. So segment 7, which has the concluding verses 40 to 42, Krishna is now going to address the impact that doubt has in our spiritual progress. Verse 40. But ignorant and faithless persons who doubt the revealed scriptures do not attain God consciousness. For the doubting soul there is happiness neither in this world nor in the next. Therefore, the doubts which have arisen in your heart out of ignorance should be slashed by the weapon of knowledge. Armed with yoga, O Bharat, stand and fight. So this was another magnificent chapter, and here Krishna has declared really these 2 foundations, that he is the Supreme Lord and his activities are transcendental, and also he is advising that one must try to learn the truth by approaching a spiritual master. Inquire from him submissively and render service unto him. These 2 transcendental pillars are the foundation for understanding the Bhagavad Gita. So there you have it, powerful, clear and divine truths in this chapter titled Transcendental Knowledge. So until we meet for chapter 5, Karma Yoga, Action in Krishna Consciousness. Namaste.
Hare Haraya Namah Krishnaya Devaya Namah Hare Haraya Namah Krishnaya Devaya Namah Hare Haraya Namah Krishnaya Devaya